So this month we're looking at our commitment to shared economy. And just as a reminder, we're looking at our commitments within our rule of life over the course of this year through the lens of St. Ignatius's teaching on consolation and desolation. So remember, consolation is that interior sense and feeling where we recognize that there's an increase in faith and hope and love at work in the sort of deep place in our soul. And desolation is basically just the opposite. Desolation is when we're feeling the energy of our faith depleting a bit, or we find somewhere on the inside of our soul, our sense of hope is running a bit dry, or we notice that love feels like a giant chore, like our love just doesn't have the energy that we know that it once had. And this ebb and flow of consolation and desolation is a normal part of the spiritual journey. And so we want to spend this whole year trying to learn how to become present to the ways in which consolation and desolation work their way out into the way of life and the rule of life that we're trying to lean into. So in our rule of life and in our commitment on a shared economy, we can see that our commitment to a shared economy reads as really one of the most simplest commitments that we have, even though I think we have a lot of development of this commitment ahead of us from a practical point of view. Like, how do we actually implement this is a question that we still hold. But it reads like this. Each member considers their possessions and resources as belonging to the Lord. As members of a common community, we make our needs known to each other and trust God to meet those needs. At the heart of this commitment is a desire to draw from the tradition this feature in the monastic life where everyone's possessions were held in common. Now, obviously, we don't have our possessions held in common in the order of the common life, but our approach to this part of the tradition is to try to offer a way of thinking about our possessions and resources as belonging to the Lord. So in all of our work of recontextualizing the monastic tradition for the 21st century, one of the primary questions that we're asking is this: what is the formational work that this particular aspect of the monastic tradition is meant to do? Like, what is the discipleship that this or that aspect of the Benedictine rule, for example, what is it trying to accomplish? So every practice or disposition that we might come across in the tradition, whether it be an individual practice or a communal one, the question I'm asking is, how do we contextualize the practice to our present day while still accomplishing the formational work? Or at the very least, how do we lean our lives in the same direction that the formational work is meant to do? And I just want to say that I don't know right now how to begin to approximate this in our lives. In the historic monastic tradition, there is a strong feature in the whole tradition that simply entering into the tradition, you are relinquishing all of your earthly goods. So I had a conversation recently with a Dominican sister here in Columbus, Ohio, and she was telling me about what it was like for her to sign over all of her assets when she entered into the Dominican order. She came into the order and she signed over everything that she had. She brought all of her assets into the order, and now she lives in a Dominican community, and her teaching salary goes to the order, and all of her living expenses come out of the order's bank account. And listen, I'm not sure entirely how this all works. This is something that I'm still learning about. I mean, she has clothes that she needs to buy and that she has money to buy. She drove a car to meet me for coffee. So she's living in the modern world. She's teaching at the Dominican University in our city. But listening to her describe what it was like to relinquish all her possessions and to give up any future capacity to build wealth was really fascinating. She told me all about the work that this has done in her, the trust and the faith that this has built in her, the commitment that it has stoked interiorly for her. So what would it look like to begin to approximate this in our lives? Like, what is the thing that we would need to pay attention to interiorly to begin to approach this in a way that is recontextualized for our lives? Many of which are tethered to families, with children to provide for. I mean, it's quite complicated. But our hope is that we can slowly find our way towards an expression of a shared economy that helps us get to the approximate formational work that this feature of the tradition is meant to provide. One of the things that I think is at the heart of this commitment is Jesus' teaching about mammon. So in Matthew's gospel, Jesus says this. He says, "No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." Now, most of the older translations, and particularly the oldest manuscripts in the early church, they did not translate the word for money into the language that it's being translated into. What many of the older texts did was leave that word that is translated here for money in the original language. And even some of our English translations keep this in place. It says, "You cannot serve both God and mammon." Like, why is that? Well, as I understand it, the early church fathers believed that the way that Jesus was using this word mammon, both here and in the Sermon on the Mount, as well as in the Gospel of Luke, was to recognize that the larger context of how Jesus was speaking about it was really referring to the power that money and material wealth had over people's lives. So there is a whole tradition that takes this word to mean that there are demonic powers at work in the accumulation of money and wealth, and that there is power that accrues to us when we accumulate money and wealth. And the power that we have increases when we accumulate money and wealth. So if serving God means that we are relying on God, serving mammon means that we are relying on that accumulation of wealth and the power that it gives us. Now, of course, there are plenty of ways that money and material possessions can be used to serve God. I mean, we absolutely know that. The point that Jesus is making here is that you can't serve both of these things. You can only serve one of these because one of them has a demonic-like power over us if we serve it. So I first heard this idea of mammon as referring to a demonic power in a talk given by Andy Crouch. So I want to give Andy some credit here. And what Andy highlights in his talk is the reality that what mammon can do to us is it can take away our dependence on God. It undercuts our faith and trust in God. If we are relying on mammon and the wealth that we have accumulated to make us feel comfort or to grant us power, like we can have a lot of power to get things done when we have a lot of money. What it probably means, says Jesus, is that if you have all of this power in the form of wealth, it is probably hindering your capacity to serve God, because what it means to serve God is to rely on God and to trust in God and to place the care of your life into the hands of God. And so this invitation to a shared economy is an invitation to be open to just relinquishing more and more power into the hands of community, out of our hands and into the hands of community. There's also a lot of formational work that is being done in the person who shows up to ask for help. There can be a lot of formational work that's happening in the journey to humility when this happens, but we're going to address that side of the equation some other time. The invitation that I want to extend to you here this month is really simple. It's to reflect on how much power money or the accumulation of wealth might have on you in this present season. That's the primary question I want you to think about. So how does this all relate to spiritual consolation or desolation? So at the beginning of each of these teachings this year, I've offered a short definition of both consolation and desolation. So again, desolation is when our soul is drawn to low and earthly things, when we feel drawn away from trusting God. It's when our faith in God and our hope for what God can do and our love for God are a bit out of a low tide. And what I've noticed in my own life is that the security of money can quickly become something that sort of grabs my attention. And this, I think, is part of what Jesus is saying. Mammon and the power of mammon can quickly draw our attention to itself in the days and the seasons of desolation. It's one of those low and earthly things. And because one of the things that St. Ignatius teaches about these movements of consolation and desolation is that when we are experiencing the pull to low and earthly things and desolation, we ought to fight against it in some really practical ways. So thinking about your money and wealth and possessions as all belonging to the Lord might be really hard during seasons of desolation because your trust and your faith in God is at a bit of a low point. But one of the ways that we could activate our memory of God's provision and the reality that we can trust in God, even when we aren't in a season of faith and hope that feels in abundance, is that we can share our money as an act of faith such that we push back on the ways that we've maybe slowly drifted in this season of desolation into overly relying on the security that we think Mammon provides, that we think money provides. So really simply put, friends, a shared economy and leaning into this practice of relinquishing money out of our hands and helping to meet the needs of others, it can break the power of Mammon's pull on us during times of desolation. It might not break the desolation, but at the very least, it's pushing back against something that we know, that Jesus tells us that we should know, that has real power over us. So this is the stuff I want us to dig into a little bit. As always, there are a few questions that we would love to have you work through this month in prayer around this commitment to a shared economy. Friends, we hope to someday have some more structured ways to practice this within OCL. But for now, think about how you can practice this commitment simply in the context of your own life, in the friendships that you have, in your church community. Be looking out for people who might be in need and ways for you to relinquish control of Mammon in your life by giving resources to those who are in need. Okay, friends, much love to you.